trying to get out of the restaurants and that type of thing as the tsunami came ashore. But there's one part there where there's this guy and he's standing out in the bay, and people walked out in the bay because all the water drained out of the bay before the tsunami. And they're looking, hey, look, the boat's just sitting there on dry ground, and oh, look, let's go walk over to the coral reef there. We can actually walk to the coral reef. And there's this one guy standing there, and just before you see him standing there, you see the people who are doing the video, they see this white cap across the horizon, and they're like, what is that? Is that a tsunami? No, that's not a tsunami. I mean, the earthquake was 1,000 miles away across the Indian Ocean. Oh, it is a tsunami. And then all of a sudden you see the local people who know they're running for the hills, or they're running for high ground. And this guy sitting in the bay, he gets washed over by the tsunami, and he passed away. So that's I always have thought that's a great picture of the end time. It's like there'll actually be kind of some unusual things that'll be kind of interesting, and then the tsunami's going to hit. And it's not just a wave, it's a tsunami. And it's a little hard to tell, and the tsunami just comes with such incredible force. So that's a picture of the end times. Now here's some channels that we're on. You can look us up there. We talk about the convergence of events and how quickly things are happening, and that there's a harmony to this. And so this is the grid that I use just real quickly: acceleration, convergence, logistics, understanding. That's in part based on Daniel chapter 12, that as we get closer to the end, we'll have a better understanding of how all of these things fit together. And I still love this picture. It's sort of a 3D picture of a music score. And you see how these things, I mean, you could make it very complex with all the different parts of an orchestra, but it's all harmonized and all works together. And that's how Scripture is. It's very complex, but it's all interconnected. And so I think there's a lot of people who are really trying hard to figure out exactly how this is going to play out. So at this point, there's still a bit of speculation involved. And I know there's speculation involved because we don't have the complete, full understanding. And I know this because I get very well-reasoned people sending me their opinions and thinking of how everything's going to work out, but they're all different. And they're good people. They're not heretical or anything like that. And so I think we need to be a little bit humble. And when we can look back with hindsight and say, oh yeah, I knew that was coming. We just need to be a little bit humble about these things. So I did 2 midweek updates today. I did Friday, I did a live a little bit after the Supreme Court decision that I'm going to talk about 2 major Supreme Court decisions this week because they're a little bit interrelated. And I do think they're related to Bible prophecy. I think you'll see from the reaction to them and the just abject lawlessness of elements of our government. Because the Supreme Court rules, and they love the Supreme Court, right? Everybody loves the Supreme Court when the court rules your way. It's just like in a court trial. Everybody loves their lawyer when they win. It's when you don't win, then you start having some issues. Because everybody wants to be, they think they're right. And then even when people lose and they have a jury rule against them, they still think they're right because they like their lawyer. Their lawyer really convinced them. It's a very interesting thing. So I did an update Friday morning. You can catch that. That was kind of a live thing. I was I couldn't get my video working correctly, so you'll see the slide, a picture of a slide there on the screen, and it's just got a smudge there where I am. Which people, don't vote on that. We're not asking you to vote on whether you want me as a smudge or a real person. I always get this high definition, like people say, you need a haircut or you need to, and it's like, I'm 68, the hair's just not doing what it used to do, So I do the best I can, and high definition is not the friend of old people. As you can, if you understand that if you've seen, well, old people understand that better than anybody. So I did a little bit of a live update Friday morning. And then Thursday, went out Thursday evening. I did one on the Middle East. Now I'm going to kind of touch on the subjects from Thursday and the subject from Friday and flesh them out a little bit and maybe go a little bit of a different direction. So some of this you will have heard, but it doesn't hurt to repeat things, because I think a lot of the things that we've seen happen over the last couple of weeks are very important from a Bible prophecy standpoint. So this is a picture of the Supreme Court. So we know that Thursday morning, was it Thursday morning or Friday morning, the Supreme Court came out with a decision. Now, on Thursday, they came out with a decision that was in a New York City case that struck down a New York City law or New York law that made it difficult to get a concealed carry. And to get a concealed carry permit in New York had said, well, you have to show that you really need a really good reason for it. And the interesting thing was, nobody could ever it was very difficult for anybody to show a very good reason, which meant that people were largely unarmed in New York and they couldn't conceal carry. But of course, the criminals, they never really followed the law on that. That didn't really seem to make any difference. And of course, when the law, so the Supreme Court strikes it down, says this, the Second Amendment is not a second-class amendment. It's an amendment, fundamental right that's recognized under our Constitution. And of course, this is one of these things where it just shows how divided society is on every issue, it seems like now. And I'm going to go through some today. And I'm going to admit, I think the people on some of these issues that I talk about today, I think the people that disagree with me are lunatics. They're insane. They're tearing society down. Now, some of them are just insane because that's the way they've been taught and they're not able to reason. I think that a lot of people are under God's judgment, which we read about in Romans chapter 1, that God gives them over to a reprobate mind, and they will lose the ability to reason. And I think we see that on an epic scale every week. So here's this decision came out, and here is a guy, Neil Katyal, and I don't know if he's a professor at Georgetown, but he's worked at some of these big elite law firms in Washington, D.C., and he's been an assistant solicitor general of the United States, which means he actually goes on behalf of the United States when he had that position and argues cases at the Supreme Court. That's a very exclusive club. There's not a lot of lawyers that get to argue cases at the Supreme Court. And it seems like the people that do it, they get hired over and over again because they've done it before. And it's hard to break into that, but he's had that opportunity. So on Thursday, he tweets this out. So the Supreme Court has come in and said, the Second Amendment really means what it says. And so here's this guy, Georgetown Law, elite law firm, assistant solicitor general of the United States. Going to be very weird if the Supreme Court ends a constitutional right to obtain an abortion next week, saying it should be left to the states to decide right after it just imposed a constitutional right to conceal carry of firearms, saying that it cannot be left to the states to decide. Now listen, that statement is moronic. Okay, because there's no right in the Constitution to an abortion. There is a right to carry firearms. I'm sorry. Any reasonable person that could set aside their political biases could see that. But so here's a smart person, probably good parent, good father, husband, whatever. But this is just nonsense. It's mumbo jumbo. And of course, what was the response of the Biden administration to this? Immediately, the Department of Justice. Now, the Department of Justice has the responsibility to what? Enforce the law. So what do they say? So it has been weaponized under Merrick Garland. If there's one thing that they should chisel on Mitch McConnell's tombstone, there are a lot of things they should chisel on, but if you want one compliment, to chisel on his tombstone is he prevented Merrick Garland from becoming the Supreme Court justice. Can you imagine if this guy was a Supreme Court justice? He's totally political. They've weaponized the Department of Justice. And so he comes out breaking. Department of Justice released a statement that they respectfully disagree with Supreme Court's ruling on New York gun law. The Department of Justice remains committed to saving innocent lives by enforcing and defending federal firearms laws. And you know what they mean there. They're going to do everything they can. And so you see reports. Goodness, there's a lot of firearms use a particular size of ammunition. And what they're doing is they're trying to essentially completely wipe out that supply. And you wipe out that supply, it means your gun doesn't, you really need ammunition for your gun to be effective. And then there's always this argument, well, whoever really stopped anything? Just go on Twitter and watch all the videos where people stop something with a firearm. And I saw one of guys in a store, and a guy comes in waving a gun. And a guy at the counter is looking at him, and he's waving the gun, pointing at everybody's head and everything, and he has a gun. Pulled it out, shot the guy 3 times, killed him. I think the guy's a hero. Sometimes people will say, well, nobody will ever have an opportunity to share the gospel with that guy. Now, I've heard this argument is made. And my argument is, what about the people that he saved? It's sort of like, I used to think about this when I was flying after 9/11. But what happens if I'm on a plane that gets hijacked? Do I sit there and do anything, or do I try to take out the terrorist? And when I say take out the terrorist, I mean take out the terrorist. And people say, well, that guy will never have, you're taking away his ability to understand the gospel. And I'm like, but there's 180 other people on the plane who will never hear the gospel if the plane goes down. So, anyway. And I'm going to get a lot of hate mail on that. So these days, you talk about firearms, you get hate mail. That's just, you're focused on that. Listen, my life includes a whole lot of issues, okay? Sometimes they relate to church and sharing the gospel and that type of thing, and sometimes they don't. We all have lives like that. But part of our duty, I think, is to try to preserve life, and that's where I think the abortion thing comes in. So the Justice Department is really not going to be the friend of the Second Amendment. That's pretty clear, at least under this regime. So here was the headlines everywhere on Saturday after the ruling on Friday. Supreme Court rejects, Roe overturned, Roe revoked, struck down, everywhere. And it's interesting that this came out almost 50 years after it was Dobbs' decision. This is the headlines of the New York Times the day after Roe was decided back in 1973. And actually, somebody sent me a calculation, and I just said, there's coincidences that happen, and so this one's kind of interesting. If you take the biblical days, a biblical year of 360 days per year, and you start when Roe was decided back in 1973, and you go 50 biblical days, 50 biblical years, you come up to May 4th, 2022, which was when the Supreme Court opinion was leaked. 50 years, biblical years to the day. And then that decision was confirmed. So the decision was not, Newsweek. This was put before, came out before the decision. You see the big sign down one of the streets. And so here's the decision. And the simple part of the decision is Justice Alito, writing for the court, said, "We, in this opinion where we began, abortion presents a profound moral question." It does. It is a profound moral question. Those who support abortion, they don't think it is. You're going to see some responses today because I like to torture you, and I'm going to and how people responded. The Constitution does not prohibit the citizens of each state from regulating or prohibiting abortion. Roe and Casey arrogated that authority. We now overrule those decisions and return that authority to the people and their elected representatives. The judgment of the Fifth Circuit is reversed and the case is remanded for further proceedings consistent with this opinion. It is so ordered. That's the crux of the ruling. Anyone who got on TV, which would be like everybody on MSNBC and most of the people on CNN, and said the Supreme Court took away the right of a woman to have an abortion in the United States is simply wrong. The ruling says it goes back to the states and the states get to decide. Now, those states may decide that they're not going to allow abortion. You'll see this. So these are the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. The 2 at the top, on the left, Amy Coney Barrett, Clarence Thomas, on the left, Neil Gorsuch, bottom, Neil Kavanaugh, and Samuel Alito. They were the 5 that decided in the case. And then you'll see the news articles don't even agree. Was it a 6-3 decision? Was it a 5-4 decision? So this is my little graphic that I made up. Those 5 on the right clearly held that Roe and Casey should be overturned. On the left, they did what you would expect the liberal wing of the court to do. They went ballistic about how terrible this was. It was just awful. This is going to ruin America. It's ruining the Constitution. It's taking away a constitutional right. And then, of course, in the center, and I put him in black and white for a reason, because he's turned into a nothing, in my opinion. Chief Justice Roberts, he's just weak. So there's a lot of theories. Is he compromised in some way? Maybe he is. Maybe he's just weak. Maybe he's just a disappointment. And there have been a lot of Republican appointed justices that have been major disappointments. We had the Warren Court back in the 60s that took prayer out of the schools. Earl Warren was a Republican appointee by Dwight Eisenhower. And we've had, Bush 43 appointed Roberts. Bush 41 appointed Thomas. Others there, Alito was a Bush 43 appointment. So we got a great justice there. And of course, there are protests. Some of the groups that support abortion, they've released the home addresses of the justices. And the Department of Justice is doing nothing, even though there is a federal statute that prohibits that. And there's a good reason for prohibiting that, because you don't want to interfere with the administration of justice. And of course, all the people who did something back on, what's that day, January 6th, they're languishing in prison. Some of them still held without bail. A year and a half later, and people are out threatening Supreme Court justices, and I only know of one that was arrested. I mean, I saw them outside of Clarence Thomas's home the other night, the videos. They're about 250. So just real quick, there were really 5 bases that Justice Alito went through on the decision. You can read it, you can download it. It's about 200 and some pages with the appendices that are attached. So the first thing he looks at is the nature of the court's area. So listen, it is clear that Roe versus Wade and Casey were the law of the land. That's how the Supreme Court had decided. And for years, the pro-life movement has been trying to do whatever they could to undermine that. And that's led to a lot of compromise, which some in the pro-life movement get really upset with. But it was the legal landscape that people were presented with. So they said, okay, then the question became, the science really changed a lot during this period of time. I have a friend who's a neonatologist, and back when I was in law school and he was in med school, he was working on it, and they were hopeful to save babies born at 26 weeks gestation. Now it's down to about 20. about half the term, they're able to save them. And they do have problems a lot of times and that type of thing. But things change. So the first thing that Alito did was we're overturning precedent, we're wiping out precedent, and immediately all the people say, oh, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, you're liars. You promised never to overturn precedent. It's not true. Overturning precedent happens with some regularity. I mean, there was, what was the case? The Dred Scott decision, which was a horrible decision. And it was overturned. Thank goodness. So it happens. So he said, so you look at the nature of the court's error. He goes, an erroneous interpretation of the Constitution is always important, but some are more damaging than others. The infamous decision in Plessy versus Ferguson was one such decision. It betrayed our commitment to equality before the law. And he goes through and he relates other cases. And he says, when he goes through and he reasons, he says, listen, the courts that did Casey and Roe were wrong. They were just wrong. There was an error, and it's a pretty serious error because it interfered with the state's ability to make a decision on a profound moral question. And this is another pet peeve of mine. You hear all of these pundits get on these shows on MSNBC and CNN and elsewhere, and even on Fox. I saw some lady on Fox. She was saying, oh, well, now we're not recognizing the woman's right to privacy. Well, really, that was Roe, and that the court really backed away from that. You need to go read it. And if you went to law school, you should go back and amend your transcript for con law to F, because you flunked. You didn't pay attention, because Casey changed things. And Casey came up with a concept, I think I'm getting this right, substantive due process. And it was the ability to fit anything you want in the world into substantive due process, which led to Alito's opinion, the other justices joining in it, and then a scathing concurring opinion from Justice Clarence Thomas. What a treasure he's been. And he's probably hated more than anybody else. In fact, Samuel Jackson, the great actor, was calling him the Uncle Thomas of the court today, making it a racial thing. And Samuel Jackson is black. The world's insane. It's crazy. So the nature of the court's error, and then the quality of the reasoning, and Alito goes through and he details. Here he says, under our precedents, the quality of the reasoning in a prior case has an important bearing on whether it should be reconsidered. We explain why Roe was incorrectly decided, but that decision was more than just wrong. It stood on exceptionally weak grounds. My constitutional law, called con law in law school, professor told me Roe was a terrible decision. It upset everything. And then that leads to the next one, and it sort of leads to the workability. Does the decision, does it set a standard that can be applied in other cases? And with all the cases we've seen over the last 50 years going up on abortion, every time a state tries to do this, because there's not a clear standard. And the science science never changed. It just became clearer to us. And it's clear, there is no question that a fetus feels pain at about 15 weeks. And so some of the pro-life states have said, okay, 15 weeks, we're cutting off no abortions after 15 weeks. And it was statutes like that came up on appeal here that led to this decision. But the law was all over the place. And it was a mess. And so the result was that a judge could pretty much do whatever they want. And so good laws that were well thought out, that were supportable, that had science and evidence and reasoning behind them, you get a judge and they don't like that law, so they're just not going to enforce it. Which is similar to what a lot of prosecutors are doing now. I don't like that law. I have prosecutorial discretion, so I don't have to enforce that law. And you see that happening. And what's happening in San Francisco, St. Louis, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, where they have prosecutors like this, the crime rates are skyrocketing. And there's a solution to it. Fire those people. Get them out of office. Impeach them. Do whatever you can. There's even lawsuits by prosecutors in Los Angeles against the Los Angeles prosecutor, Gascon, who used to be up in San Francisco. I guess destroying one city was not good enough for him. He wanted to put the destruction of a second city on his resume. They filed lawsuits against them saying there's things we can't do under the law. So the workability thing that Justice Alito talked about is this. Our president's counsel that another important consideration to deciding whether a president should be overruled is whether the rule it imposes is workable. That is, whether it can be understood and applied in a consistent and predictable manner. And on that, with that standard, Roe and Casey failed miserably. And then another one was the effect on other areas of law. And this is something that Justice Thomas picked up in on his concurring opinion and says we really need to maybe go back and correct some other egregious errors that we've made. You know, like on some of the, I think he mentioned contraception cases, some of the privacy cases, and he mentioned, of course, the marriage decision, which had no basis in substance. It was just 5 people that decided we think we should rule this way. And so, we're blessed that there was a president who appointed 3 justices, and I'm not a big fan of I'm sort of a fan of Gorsuch, and I'm not sure about Kavanaugh, I'm not sure about Barrett. They haven't been on the bench long enough. But, they don't seem like they've found their footing yet. But nevertheless, they did a good job in this case, and thank goodness we had a president who appointed them. That was a blessing. Say whatever you will about President Trump. He appointed 3 people that got us rid of this horrific decision. But now the real fight begins because it's going to be a fight. In fact, here's what Thomas said in his opinion. Moreover, apart from being demonstrably incorrect reading of the Due Process Clause, the legal fiction of substantive due process is particularly dangerous. At least 3 dangers favor jettisoning the doctrine entirely. So he goes off and he says the first one is it gives the judge way too much power. Judges shouldn't be legislating, and this has been legislating from the bench. Now, Kavanaugh in his decision, in his concurring opinion, I think this is one reason why I don't like him. When you go through the confirmation process, the judge is not supposed to say how he's going to rule on a case. Whether he's a liberal or conservative, they're just not supposed to say that. And they're told not to say that. And everybody tries to trap them into saying that. You watch the hearings. But here's what Kavanaugh does. He says, if some state puts in a law that says women can't travel to another state, that violates the right to travel. And so I would rule this way in that particular case. He shouldn't be doing that. Now, that may be a correct decision. I don't know. I don't know how enforceable it will be. So the effect of it is that and there was another part of the decision. The 5th one was reliance interest, and I won't bother going into that in the interest of time. You can get the opinion and read that. And there are plenty of good articles. I found an article, I think it was at Town Hall or Isra Pundit, that analyzed the thing quickly. So the lavender states will allow abortion. The lighter gray ones, it's kind of up in the air. The dark red states will, the red states, lighter red, will be banned within a month. The darker red are already banned. They became effective immediately. And then the sort of, I guess you would call that orange states like Iowa, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, Georgia, and South Carolina, those states are likely to ban it. And there's legislation in Ohio to do that. Here's another, this is from the Wall Street Journal, another colored map. And some states have trigger bans so that whenever Roe is overturned or Casey is overturned, the law automatically becomes effective in some cases like 30 days after the decision. So there's some courts, some states where abortion is still effectively in place, but in 30 days it'll be banned. And then there's all these other states. And there's been a let's see, I'm trying to remember. Oh, okay, here's Ben Rhodes, our famous friendly children's author who was one of the major children's book author who was a major advisor to Obama. And just really a despicable person, in my opinion. I'm sure that will really ruin his day if somebody tells him I said that. But he says this is an extreme, the current SCOTUS majority has an extreme degree of illegitimacy when you consider how it came to be. Why? Well, because the Russians stole the election for Trump in 2016 and he appointed 3 justices. So that election, by the way, you can complain about that election. Hillary Clinton's still complaining about it. I thought we were supposed to respect the integrity of the ballot box. This whole thing is just, I've said this before, if hypocrisy was water, the world would drown. Bush versus Gore itself elevated George W. Bush to the presidency, Rhodes says, after he lost the popular vote, and with Florida still contested. That in turn led to the appointments of Roberts and Alito. Hey, Ben Rhodes, go back to school. You don't elect presidents in the United States. It's a very unique system. It's called the American system. It's based on the American Constitution, and you don't elect presidents by the popular vote. It's called the Electoral College. And it's to prevent lunatics that live in big cities like DC and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle from controlling the outcome of elections. It was a very wise thing. And of course, they're trying to attack it. So even the Secretary of Defense came out and he said, well, we have this ruling and we're going to protect the women in the military. And by the way, everybody knows who a woman is now. They all know what the definition of a woman is. Well, not quite. You're going to see one governor here in a moment. It's still not quite up to speed on the whole women give birth thing, which seems pretty fundamental. But Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is like, we're gonna try to do this in the military. And I saw the people on a Twitter thread, they're saying, yes, we need to have military readiness, and they're interfering with military readiness because now women are going to have to carry children to term in some places. Like, we want our infantry to, I'm sorry, it sounds sexist, but it's true. You'll see a picture of Megan Rapinoe here in a minute. She's a star soccer player, superb soccer player. Do you know that the women's World Cup team, the U.S. women's team that won the World Cup, played an exhibition match against 15-year-old high school players? They're really good players. They were elite players. And they lost. The women's World Cup soccer team lost to a bunch of 15-year-old guys. It's because there's a difference. Okay? It's sort of, yeah, listen, I'm sure that there are a lot of, if I play tennis, I'm sure there are a lot of women tennis players that could just beat me like a drum. But that's not the general rule. If you get above a certain skill level, the men are just stronger. It's a fact of science. But of course now we've got to be woke. We got to have a woke military. And so this came out. And then this is a Twitter thread at BNN Newsroom. The Pentagon has stated that any abortion laws enacted as a result of the Supreme Court decision will not be recognized. So there was a discussion before the decision came down. There was a Zoom, these Zoom calls, and one of the persons involved is a female. I'm pretty sure it's a female. They're both females, actually, but one is the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. And so they were talking about what are you going to do about Roe? Because the decision's coming up. We had this leaked decision. And by the way, the leaked decision was almost identical in the substantive parts to the decision that Alito issued. He added things to it. He added things like, in their dissent, these people, these other justices, their reasoning is bad. And he added those parts because he didn't know what it was back in May. Now he knows about it, and he's written down, and he effectively just, in my opinion, he tears them to shreds. And of course, he also addresses some of the things in some of the concurring opinions. So here's a discussion, and I want you to listen to what Governor Whitmer is talking about. You'll get the point.
Passing if Roe v. Wade fails, what can voters do to help preserve our freedom of choice?
So we saw where we thought Dobbs was going to be headed, and this was prior to the draft opinion coming out publicly. So we looked at all the tools that I have as governor and determined that, okay, a couple unique things I can do. Number one, I have the constitutional ability to bring a lawsuit to protect constitutional rights of people of Michigan. So I brought a lawsuit on behalf of all the menstruating people in Michigan, 2.2 million, and another tool I have is to go straight to our state Supreme Court.
Okay, so you see what she had to do. She couldn't say women. Okay, she had to say menstruating people. So she gets, so here's how I would score this if I was scoring it. She gets 1 woke point for saying menstruating people instead of women. She gets 5 idiot points for acting like she's a moron, okay? I'm sorry. So this is from Stars and Stripes. Again, this is related to Austin. Now, what's also happened, though, is there's another response is that some states, California's already enacted legislation to pay for women to come to California to get an abortion. There are corporations that are doing this. Apple, I believe, I'm pretty sure Apple, Disney have said they will pay up to $4,000 for a woman to travel expenses to fly to another state if their state bans abortion. Because, we got to get those women back working for the company right away. We can't have them out on maternity leave or anything like that. That would, and they're going to add that dependent to our health care bill. And they're the ones who are compassionate. Give me a break. So the West Coast states of, so this might be where the tsunami warning thing really applies. On the West Coast of the United States, California, Washington, and Oregon have come out and said, we're going to do a new multi-state commitment to defend access to reproductive health care, including abortion and contraceptives, and committed to protecting patients and doctors. And here's the governors of those 3 states. This is only a minute long, so bear with me.
Reproductive freedoms are under attack.
Red states and Republican-stacked courts have rolled back the rights of Americans.
Today, with the Supreme Court ruling to overturn Roe versus Wade, more than half the states in the United States ban abortion outright or severely restrict access to abortion services.
That's why California, Oregon, and Washington are building the West Coast offense to protect patients' access to reproductive care.
We're going to work with our legislators, with our providers, with our patient advocates.
We will continue to protect patients from any state who come to our states for abortion care.
Defend doctors, nurses, and medical professionals working to support patients seeking reproductive care in our states.
We're going to protect patient privacy.
We will resist intrusions by out-of-state prosecutors, law enforcement, or vigilantes trying to investigate patients receiving services in our states.
Stop misinformation.
And we're going to expand access to abortion services for the people in need.
We will not stand on the sidelines.
The West Coast of the United States is going to stand strong.
We'll fight like hell to protect your rights and your safety.
Okay, and you see, Newsom, he gets his got to get his woke point in there for misinformation. You got to mention misinformation, which is, so, rule of thumb, when you get a lefty like Newsom, whatever they say, the other people are doing is what they're doing. So if they accuse you of violence and insurrection and stuff, they're the ones who are doing it. This is a simple rule of law. And here's their compact that they've decided. So there are other responses from around the world. This is the Edmonton Sun. I'm supposed to speak at a conference next year in Alberta and Calgary, I think in April or May. Back to the dark ages. And of course, Justin Trudeau came out and said, we're going to protect the rights of women. While he's a scofflaw, he's not doing things that he's supposed to do ethically and legally in Canada. This is from the Israel Hayom, which is, it's a Hebrew language paper. It was started by Sheldon Edelson. And I read it, but I just have noticed the shift in its orientation. In fact, well, I don't know if I should say it or not. Well, she put it on Facebook. They fired Caroline Glick this week. Now, does that say about everything? And you know how we feel about Caroline around here. And so they're like, divisive. It's a very divisive decision. Should have let it go. Can't believe those people went back to the dark ages. I mean, this is from a newspaper that 6 months ago I would have said, you want to read it as an alternative. So it is a divisive issue. Here's the London Times this morning, splintered, and look at the editorial cartoon in the paper this morning. The Statue of Liberty is this Handmaid's Tale that's pregnant, and it's being torn down and destroyed by people. Americans brace for turmoil as Borden puts the thing on the bout. That's also from this morning's London Times. This is the editorial section of the New York Times this morning. The radical reign of Clarence Thomas. A dangerous new era of the Washington Post. Okay, now I'm going to play you a clip. This is from Libs of TikTok, and I worked hard to bleep out all the words, so I apologize in advance if I miss them. I think I got them all. And this is about a minute long, and so I want you to listen to it, though, because I think it tells you where a lot of people that are walking around and driving a car and having a phone and that type of thing, they're thinking this as they're walking around. So I don't know who this person is, but here's what she had to say.
Get angry! This is atrocious! This is war on women! How dare the Supreme Court do this? You Kavanaugh, you Gorsuch, for lying under oath when you were confirmed, saying that you believe that this was settled. Women will die. But as long as it fits your Christian narrative, it must be correct. Not everybody believes in your Sky Daddy. Not everybody believes in your Cloud Papa. The fact that you tied religion to your decision is pathetic. Rolling back the clock on women's rights and bodily autonomy is pathetic. You care more about your guns than you do a woman's life. I pray you never get another restless night's sleep in your life thinking about what you did to women. This is not over, not by a long shot. How dare you? Karma does not forget. And she may take some time to come back around, but she will get to you. Not on my watch.
Okay, I played this for a friend, and the comment was, well, I don't think if anybody ever watched that, she's really going to have to worry about having to have an abortion. So somebody said, okay, look, enough of these response videos. This is 20 seconds. I'm just going to make a compilation of the reaction of these people, and here's that video. this is,
For nearly 50 years, we have talked about what Roe v. Wade protects. Today, as of right now, as of this minute, we can only talk about what Roe v. Wade protected. Past tense. In holding that, it is not deeply rooted in our history. Today's decision on that theory, then, calls into question other rights that we thought were settled, such as the right to use birth control, the right to same-sex marriage, the right to interracial marriage. The strength of our nation has always been that we move forward. Today, I invite all people to stand together in defense of one of the most fundamental ideals and principles that for generations, for centuries, I believe, we had held dear.
okay, enough of that. And there's been responses. This is, somebody sent this to me, is from the Denver Post today. I think it came out today, about a Longmont, Colorado, north of Denver, a pregnancy crisis center has been vandalized, caught fire. And it says here, if abortions aren't safe, neither are you. There's been some other attacks on pregnancy centers. They're supposed to be threats against churches and that type of thing. You need to understand that we're living in this very volatile time. There's a lot of things going on with Charlie Vector and everything that I just don't have time to get into today. Molly Hemingway, I would put her up there with Caroline Glick. She's now editor-in-chief at The Federalist. I saw her on Fox a couple times over the weekend, since Friday, and she has an article up about the White House. Biden is hiding his plan to rig the 2022 midterm elections. They have weaponized at least 200 federal agencies to interfere with the voting process. And you're saying, well, they're allowed to do that. They're doing it at the executive level of the United States, and it's a local government issue. The president is not allowed by a thing called the Constitution to do this. And people are filing Freedom of Information Act requests, and they're getting denied. And the person who's really spearheading this is a person named Susan Rice, described as almost Barack Obama's sister, who's the main domestic policy chief at the White House. She may be I don't know if she's the one writing up the cue cards for the president. Did you see that the other day? He dropped a cue card or showed it. It's like, walk to podium, turn and face crowd. And then you have this transgender thing. And so this is Fairfax, Virginia. They'll investigate people who go to the school boards and complain. I saw a mother at a school board. I don't know where. You can find it. I think it might have been on Libs of TikTok this morning on Twitter. Her daughter was given a reading list that recommended a book called Gender Queer. Her daughter is 11. This is a sexually explicit book that her grade school teacher recommended on a list that this is one you might want to read over the summer. And she went and complained. Everybody said, well, she didn't have to read it. I mean, you're a mother. You should keep her from reading it. Well, what if she never showed me the list? So Fairfax now, if you misgender classmates, you're going to be punished. And you see this now. I see this in some law firm emails I get. People are putting their pronouns on there, how they want to be referred to. Biden, talked about this a couple weeks ago, and they came out this week with regulations. They're going to require all these transgender rules under Title IX. Title IX was the law that came to effect 50 years ago. And to celebrate the 50th year, we're going to really ratchet down on these rules. And by the way, schools, if you don't do this, we're going to deny you lunch money. You may have kids, the kids can starve and not eat. And the school lunch program is very important in certain neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods. But they don't care about that, the compassionate people. You can call it communism, Marxism, Alinskyism, whatever. They're tearing it all down. And I'm just saying I'm concerned about the elections. And so they came out with these proposed regulations, 700 pages. 700 pages for Title IX. And Megan Rapinoe, she was interviewed for Time Magazine the other day. You can go read it. And she's saying things like, well, we should protect the rights of transgender people. So essentially what she's saying in sports. Because see, what happened was one of the swimming association came out and said, if you're a male, you go through puberty, you can never swim in women's events. Because you've changed, your body changed. And so what she's saying is, well, listen, I was a star athlete. I don't care about women coming up behind me because this transgenderism thing is so much more important. So I'll talk a little bit about, so we have this thing with the power grid and the lakes, the reservoirs, particularly Lake Mead and Lake Powell, are way down. I mean, these people would have been way deep in water not too long ago. We still have problems with grain coming out of Ukraine. Household confidence at all-time low. This was from Zero Hedge this morning. Bloomberg, more than 8 million Americans are late on rent as prices increase. And I was talking to some people involved in banking, and I don't know what's going to happen. It could be very, very bad. I was told by somebody in banking that if we foreclosed on every commercial loan that could be foreclosed, we would be in a depression far worse than the 1930s. It would pale by comparison. And so it's just everything is on a knife's edge as far as the economy goes. And I've seen pictures of stores that don't have much on the shelves in some places, even here locally. I've noticed a little bit of a change. And the other thing you're going to see them doing is they're moving the inventory around in the schools, the stores, to mask the shortages. So whereas they used to put 12 deep of something on the shelf, they'll put it maybe 1 or 2 deep. So it looks like the shelves are full. You have this problem with a thing called DEF, which is related to all diesel trucks have to use it. Saw a report from Dave Walsh, a guy you could follow, Dave Walsh Energy on Getter, Dave Walsh Energy. And he was saying is the reason all these flights are being canceled is the airlines can't make any money unless they can only break even on the fuel costs if the plane is 85% full. So they sort of wait to see how many people show up, and then if it's not 85% full, they cancel the flights. And I've not flown anywhere, but I've just heard horror stories. Listen, I used to travel a lot. I was on a plane 6 days a week for many years. And I can tell you that about every travel horror story that you could imagine happened to me over that time. My assistants that I had over those years used to laugh about it. I haven't even had that experience. I'm just not sure I really want to go to the hassle of travel. Here is Gutierrez is talking about the food crisis. This is in a conference sponsored by Germany. Hang on here. Secretary General of the UN.
We face an unprecedented global hunger crisis. The war in Ukraine has compounded problems that have been brewing for years. climate disruption, the COVID-19 pandemic, the deeply unequal recovery. This was already apparent when I visited the Sahel region of Africa last month. Leaders warned me that unless we act now, a dangerous situation could turn into a catastrophe. And the Horn of Africa is also suffering its worst drought in decades. According to the World Food Programme, in the past 2 years, the number of severely food insecure people around the world has more than doubled to 276 million. There is a real risk that multiple famines will be declared in 2022, and 2023 could be even worse. The main costs to farmers are fertilizers and energy. Fertilizer prices have risen by more than half in the past year, and energy prices by more than 2/3. All harvests will be hit, including rice and corn, affecting billions of people across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. This year's food access issues could become next year's a global food shortage.
Hunderte, es sind nicht Tausende, es sind...
We are not talking about hundreds or thousands. We are talking about millions of people. There are 345 million women, children and men worldwide who are facing an acute shortage of food. We are facing a famine crisis that confronts us like a threatening wave. Russia's attack on Ukraine has turned this wave into a tsunami.
And that's where I got the title for today. So we'll make her our guest prophecy updater for the week. And so, look, there are negotiations going on to try to get grain, 25 million tons of grain that's stored in Ukraine to get it to market. There's some indications that it might happen, and it might not. Russia doesn't seem, from my perspective, Russia doesn't seem to be inclined to do that. There's also this road, there's this place called Kaliningrad where Lithuania is cutting off access to that for Russia. Russia's making a lot of threats about that. Russia seems to be blockading the Ukrainian grain for the time being. There's also reports that the gas flows, and it's like everything else in the world, there's a whole bunch of, a couple reasons given for everything. So you have to kind of pick and choose what you want. So Germany, they're not getting the gas that they needed from Russia, part because they don't want it. But then there's also reports that the gas flows through some of the pipelines from Russia have been slowed down even to the point of zero. Now, some people say Russia's doing that intentionally. Other people say, well, no, Russia needs maintenance parts for their pipelines and their pumping stations, and they can't get those because of the sanctions that have been imposed. So, everybody, you got the circular firing squad going on where everybody's pointing the finger at each other. But Germany is going to restart old coal-fired plants, so they have power. I think Dave Walsh on the War Room podcast was talking about the fact that this whole green renewable thing is a scam. So they say that green renewable energy has replaced 46%. Well, it's 46% if it's working. And guess what? It only works about 8% of the time in Germany. And so they need to have always on power. Well, you don't get that from wind. You don't get that from solar in cloudy Germany. And it's a little bit far north. I think most of Germany is as far north as like Boston. So, but then the EU comes out and says, well, we got to respect the climate change initiatives, and all this other stuff. And it's just everything's being torn down. So the one thing that's clear, though, is that the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia are not working. Here's a report from Sky News Australia talking about that.
Head of the International Energy Agency is warning European countries to prepare contingencies in the event Russia completely shuts off the gas supply to the continent during winter. Several countries have reported receiving significantly less Russian gas than what would be expected in the coming weeks. Russian officials claim the drop in supply isn't deliberate and are blaming technical issues. The IEA's executive director, Fatih Birol, is sceptical and believes the reduction is a strategic decision. Energy companies in Italy, Austria and Slovakia are all reporting significant drops in supply over the past fortnight.
So whatever the reason, there's been a drop in supply. And so the question is asked, this was a report at DW Deutsche Welle, is it going to be a dark winter for Europe? Here's G, this is what G said in a talk. It's been proved time and again that sanctions are a boomerang and a double-edged sword to politicize the global economy and turn it into one's tool or weapon, and willfully impose sanctions by using one's primary position in the international financial and monetary systems will only end up hurting one's own interest and inflict suffering on everyone. So he seems to be aligned. This is Putin talking about starting a new G8 group with the people who aren't participating in the sanctions, and that would be China, India, Russia, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, Iran, and Turkey. And that's kind of an interesting when you start talking about an alliance, particularly with one involving Iran and Turkey. So one of the solutions to I'll just do a couple slides on this. And like I said, I did an update on Thursday where I talk about this. Europe has gone to Israel. It says, hey, Israel, you've got gas out there in the Mediterranean, and we want the gas because we're not getting it from Russia. We're into a long-term contract with you. So they've signed a memorandum of understanding. It's not a final agreement yet. And I think it does have some potentially prophetic significance. We always talk in Ezekiel 38, 39, talks about the hook in the jaw. What's the hook in the jaw? And some people speculate that it's oil or gas that brings, if it's Russia, it's this Magog. And that's even arguable, and I've talked about that. But let's just say it is. Is it the gas oil that brings them down into Israel to attack Israel? That it could be. Now, I'm just saying, there was an interview in this morning's Jerusalem Post, or Friday's Jerusalem Post, with one of the executives of the gas company that's doing the drilling there in the Mediterranean. And he said, look, this is to get things changed, to get the gas to Europe is about a 2 to 3 year process at best. So if they build a pipeline, it's about a 5-year process, and it costs $10 billion, maybe more, assuming they can get the supplies now. The other alternative is to pipe it down to Egypt, liquefy it, put it on an LNG tanker, and then transport it to Europe that way. And that's a possibility, but Egypt doesn't have a huge capacity. And it'll take a long time to get that capacity built in Israel to do that. Egypt can only do so much, and then they don't have enough ports to do this. So the other thing that happened in response to this is once Israel announces the find of another new gas field, Lebanon goes in and they want to change the maritime border. So Israel is saying the red line at the top there, or the number one line, that should be the border. That's how international law should recognize it. And for a lot of years, they've been doing this. It's line 23 is what Lebanon, which is effectively controlled by Hezbollah, said. Well, then there's this gas field, and there's another one that's not on here, the Karish field. And they put a big thing. Here's another little bit better look at it. And so the one gas field may straddle the line if everybody accepts 23, or that's what arbitration decides. But now Lebanon came out and said, no, it's line 29 because it splits the Karish field. And that's where Israel brought in this big drill ship to start drilling in the Karish field, which was clearly not within the line. It's just Lebanon was making it up, and Hezbollah was issuing threats, and we're going to go after you if you do this. So that's, right now it looks like Lebanon has withdrawn this. Algeria has put in place a draft law criminalizing normalization with the Zionist entity. That's similar to what Iraq just did recently. So if you have any relations with Israelis, we're going to come after you. And Algeria has, for example, they have reserves of 159 trillion cubic feet of gas. Israel has reserves, depending on how you have it calculated, of 6 to 8 trillion cubic feet. So Israel could supply a lot of what Europe needs if they had the capacity to produce that much, Europe imports about 80 billion cubic feet annually. That includes what comes from Russia. So right now, I don't think it's in place where it's actually a conflict. Now, I also mentioned this. There's a lot going on in the space between Israel and Iraq. You can go watch my Thursday update for more details. But the economist who had the grains of wheat, the shocks of wheat that had the skulls on them, talking about a coming food catastrophe. They're also talking about AI's new frontier and how great AI is going to be. And they also did an interview with Naftali Bennett, who, as of, I don't know, maybe now or tomorrow, will no longer be the prime minister of Israel. It's going to be Yair Lapid, who is a lefty. The Israeli government failed. They're going to go to the 5th round of elections in the last 3 years. It's like waterboarding the entire population of a country to make them go through this time after time. So he said, we're going to adopt the ostrich doctrine. We're going to go after the head of the octopus now instead of the tentacles. So you've seen substantial escalation in the attacks going back and forth between Israel and Iran. This is going to be an issue. So Biden is supposed to go to Israel in a couple weeks for meetings. And he's also going to Saudi Arabia, begging for oil. And Israel has said, at least in this article, said that they were going to ask Biden for defense funding of the laser system called Iron Beam. Now, Iron Beam will help somewhat if Hezbollah, Lebanon, Iran launch a massive missile attack on Israel. But it's not going to be enough. Let's give you some statistics. So last year, you remember there was the conflict between Hamas and Gaza and Israel around this time. During that period of time, over a couple-week period, I think it lasted, Hamas launched about 4,000 to 4,500 rockets at Israel. That was about all that the Iron Dome batteries could handle. The Iron Dome is very sophisticated. It gets the missile, before it shoots, because each missile costs at least $50,000 to shoot down that rocket. So it's expensive, very, very expensive. So it calculates and it says, well, that's going to land in an open field someplace. We're not going to worry about that one because they don't want to use too many. But that number of rockets is pretty much pushing Iron Dome to its capacity. And what happens is they deplete all of their Iron Dome rockets when one of these attacks happen. That's 4,500 over a 2-week period. Back in 2006, there were about 4,500 rockets launched by Lebanon, Hezbollah into Israel during a 6-week, I think it was called the Second Lebanon War. And right now we're in the midst of the 40th anniversary of the First Lebanon War. And of course, you see a lot of things with this. So Israel's now come up with this thing called the Iron Beam. It's a laser. And as you can see from the video, that's from Rafael Systems, the developer. It's very effective, but it has a very limited range, maybe 2 kilometers, maybe 1.5 miles. They have to have the laser within 1.5 miles of the rocket. Well, that's problematic. Now, it costs literally a few dollars for the electricity to fire the laser, but it has limited range. So 2021, 4,500 rockets in 2 weeks. 2006, 4,500 rockets from Iran and its proxies in 6 weeks. They have 150 to 200,000 rockets now in Lebanon and Syria. The estimate is that there will be at least 4,500 rockets per day in the next round of incursion, next war. This is a problem for Israel. Now, Israel's very good at defending itself, But Israel's also making plans too, because of what's going on in this northern theater. Here with this is Israeli attacks in Syria. I've talked about this from the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal has done a very good job lately of getting some good solid exclusives. But those rockets, they're going to cause a lot of. I'm not a prophet. I'm looking at what I see geopolitically. There is going to be a war between Israel and Iran and the Iranian proxies. In Syria, Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon, other Iranian proxies in Syria, and then Hamas in Gaza. And there's also Hamas in Lebanon. And they're all Iranian proxies, and they're all going to go after Israel. So there's a problem when these rockets start going. It's going to cause a lot of damage, death, suffering, destruction in northern Israel, all over Israel, depending on how far the rockets can reach. Look at Ukraine right now, okay? Forget who's right or wrong. A lot of people dying and getting hurt in Ukraine. I mean, there's a lot of carnage, and it's hurting both armies. I mean, Russia has lost a lot of people, and Ukraine is losing. I've heard 200 to 1,000 soldiers are getting killed each day, let alone injured. And that over half the Ukrainian force is out of commission because they've been killed or injured in 4 months. But Russia's also having true problems. And of course, the pro-Russian people will be right. It's like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You need to listen to so-and-so. And I'm like, look, I can see what's going on. There's a lot of suffering going on over there on both sides. And I don't think Russia's really, they're going to win. They have the artillery. They have the shells and the ammunition. Ukraine has sort of leftovers from the Soviet era, and they're using the same caliber rockets and artillery shells that the Russians are using, and the Russians have cornered the market on the supply. So we can send all kinds of rockets over there and everything, but it's no good to the Ukrainians because they can't use it because they don't have the right kind of launcher. But there's going to be a lot of people hurt in northern Israel. This, I think, is inevitable. We were in Nahariya, which is just south of the Lebanese border, a few miles, with some friends when we were there 5 years ago. And they said when it starts, we're pretty much toast because we're 3 miles from the border. Doesn't take long for a rocket. We don't even have time to get to our car and let alone load it up with anything and leave. So there's going to be a lot. And I think if you look at, I won't go into this too much today because I know I'm droning on here. Drone, that's what we haven't even talked about the drones yet. But it is, I think this is, it's certainly implied in Scripture when you read Ezekiel 38 and 39. It talks about Israel living at peace. Right now, they're not living at peace. They've got a lot of people after them. And so, but I think there will be a war. I think Iran will be defeated. And I think there will be a period of peace. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But the other component, though, is, Israel's had a lot of trouble in Arab villages within Israel and the Arab parts since that last Gaza war last year. And the concern among Israeli military is, how do we have to do the rockets and the drones that are coming our way, and there's going to be incursions across the border in the north, and they're going to try to kidnap people, then we'll have a hostage situation. But then what if the Arab population throws in with Hezbollah within Israel? Now we have riots and everything in Israel and street fighting in Israel. It's a very complicated situation, but I think Israel will prevail. But it will be at a great cost. But there will be a peace, and I think that's implied before Ezekiel 38 and 39 happens, that there will be some kind of peace that takes place. So I think all of this is very significant. Now, there was so this was, and I talked about this too, this is an article from Milliyet, which is a Turkish newspaper, and they talked about the fact that in Istanbul, there was an Israeli diplomat and Israeli tourist who had been threatened by Iranian teams for kidnapping and murder. They were going to assassinate them. The Mossad found out about it. They went to the Turks and they flew in there. They rescued these people in armored vans. Israel is amazing to me on these things. It's just the way they protect their people, because they learned the lessons from World War II. We're not going to let this happen again. When you're in Israel, we talk about, you can't have open carry, you can steal kids, it's just terrible. But you see these kids out playing soccer all over Israel, and there's usually two guys walking the sidelines with, M16 or an Uzi, because they've had children murdered in terrorist attacks, and they're not going to let it happen again. Go to the Holocaust Museum and go to the Yad Vashem and go to the Children's Memorial. It will tear your heart out, but it will also help you understand what you see in Israel. So they had this, Israel was able to get this, and Turkey cooperated. Turkey's been very cooperative. It really was sort of a spy thriller. But all the time, now there's these reports that Iran is enriching to 90%. They're getting closer and closer to a weapon. And there's these reports that are coming out that they're increasing their underground facilities. We know they're doing drones. And then you have all these sort of the bad luck that people have in Iran with, there were one guy, he fell off a building and died. He was one of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, one of their subdivisions. Then the Iranians came out and said, well, he committed suicide. And now it appears that he was taken out. They fired the spy chief in charge of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard because he wasn't doing a very good job, because there's all these guys dying in Iran. There's protests going on. The Iranian regime is under a lot of pressure right now. And I think Caroline had a good article last week saying, hey, we need to support the Iranian people and help them. But absent getting an overthrow of the regime, there's going to be a war. And this was an explosion. This is from Al-Qabas, which is a Kuwaiti newspaper. And Al-Qabas told the story about what happened a week ago. There was a drone attack on a Iranian Revolutionary Guard corps. Now, Iran is coming. Usually it's, what did they say? It's a baby formula factory, or it's a pharmaceutical factory that blows up. They always have an explanation for it, but they've pretty much come out and admitted now, somebody launched a drone attack on our facility west of Tehran, west of downtown Tehran. And these other people, they're being killed in downtown Tehran in the middle of the day. What happened here, though, was there was a bunch of drones, suicide drones, that attacked this place, and it turns out they were assembled and launched 10 kilometers away from the target. That's 6 miles. Like closer than it is from my church, from the church to my house. Somebody assembled the drones and launched them. That's amazing. It's an incredible story. So that was in Al-Qabas, and then you have these other guys who seem to be having a lot of bad luck. And this is from the Wall Street Journal. Israel widens covert actions to rein in Iran. And so at the other end of this is another thing that's going on, and I talk about this some. Here's the firing of the spy chief from the Tasnim news agency, or Tasnim news agency, and it's an Iranian government news agency. They said, we fired the spy chief, but he need to take a vacation, and we want to make the spy thing more efficient. Translation is, we're tired of our guys getting killed in downtown Tehran. We want to do something about it. This guy's lucky he's escaping with his life. So we talk a little bit, I talk a fair amount about Psalm 83. Controversial in Bible prophecy community, is that a prophecy or not? I think it's significant. There are 10 nations really mentioned in Psalm chapter 83. That number 10 is significant. It's the areas around there. And there's a lot of things going on in that space right now. This is I forget what paper I got this from. These people were involved in the news. Biden's going there. Naftali Bennett is out. But the other guys, they're all getting together and meeting. They're all getting together. Mohammed bin Salman has been sort of on a, what I would call the Mohammed bin Salman redemption tour. First thing he did was he went to Egypt to meet with al-Sisi, recognizing our deep and historic ties, signing big deals for money. And then he went to Turkey to meet with Erdogan. But before that, he went to Jordan and met with King Abdullah of Jordan. Now, there's a good article in the Jerusalem Post about a week ago by David Weinberg, who works with the Israeli Defense and Security Forum. And he was talking about, listen, Abdullah is a crafty little guy, and you need to watch him. And I don't trust him. He never mentions Jewish holy sites. It's only Christian and Muslim holy sites. So there's a push because, and he's coming out, he's always been pushing this two-state solution. And you're starting to see this kind of bleed. This is Foreign Affairs article about the Abraham Accords don't really deal with the Palestinian issue. That needs to be done. Even the Wall Street Journal a week ago or 2 weeks ago had this article, Jordan Palestinian Confederation. And essentially what they said is, well, why don't we just make these Palestinian areas of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, we'll just put a corridor over to Jordan, and we'll put one over to Gaza, and Jordan can rule over all of them. And most of Jordan, 75% of Jordan is Palestinian people anyway. I think the wife of King Abdullah II is a Palestinian herself. So they floated this plan. I think this plan has been around. There's a thing called the Elan Plan. And essentially what it would take is Israel would get the Jordan Valley, they'd get settlement areas, but then the large bulk of the areas in this high part of the West Bank would be given to the Jordanians. Some people call it the Jordan option. Now, Caroline did write at Newsweek this last week that Biden is really trying to undermine Israeli sovereignty. She's exactly right. But this Elan plan, if you see the way this is crafted, goes back into at least the 1970s. This has been floated around. It looks very similar to the Trump peace plan. Whoops. I'm not sure why oh, there we go. The way the areas are crafted apart. And so this plan is insane. It won't work, but you're seeing everybody and their brother pushing it now. Wall Street Journal. Other people are talking about it. It was even part of the Trump plan. Now, the Trump plan was never accepted, but it was part of the plan that was proposed. And I have a problem with that. And Jared Kushner and Ivanka, by the way, head of the Abraham Accord Peace Institute, raising a lot of money from the Saudis for investments in Israel. They were in Israel this week, went to the Western Wall. So this is a graphic from Mark Langfan's presentation. You can find it on Facebook. It's from about 5 years ago, where he talked about this Elan plan. And what you see in that dark blue area, which goes from Tel Aviv to Haifa, that's where about 80% of Israeli citizens live. So they want to give the ridge line there in the West Bank to the Palestinians. Israel would get the Jordan Valley and the immediate heights. But the problem is that is the water, what they would give to the Palestinians is the watershed. So you want to give the Palestinians control of the watershed when water is such a big deal in the Middle East? It would be national suicide. So I don't think it's going to go anywhere. So that's Jordan, Abdullah. Get David Weinberg's article and read it. He'll give you a lot of great information about, I think, why Abdullah is undermining the Abraham Accords. And he's acting in his best interest, I don't think he's to be trusted. That's just my opinion. So here is the other place. So after he goes to Jordan, Mohammed bin Salman goes to Turkey. And they have this big meeting. And it's kind of interesting, the pictures that come out of this. So in the Turkish press and elsewhere, you see Erdogan and Mohammed bin Salman, they're shaking hands and they're smiling and all of this stuff. But other pictures that come out afterwards, like here's a picture from the Arab news. So on the right, you see the Turkish paper, Sabah, a Erdogan publication. Excuse me. And on the left, you see the Arab news, the Saudi publication from the Saudi news agency. And look at the picture. You see the image that's there? I'm humiliating Erdogan. Erdogan needs the money and that type of thing. And in a very unusual thing, this never happens with anybody else. So here is Mohammed bin Salman. He's leaving Turkey to go back home. And this is the airport. Erdogan took him to the airport. And you need to understand the imagery of what's going on. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman is being rehabilitated. And I've talked to you about the Saudis and ESG, NEOM, the money that Aramco is making right now. And Erdogan sees him off on the plane. This never happens. When Erdogan went to Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago, it was a secondary level minister that took him to the airport. Mohammed bin Salman did not. But in this case, Erdogan went with Mohammed bin Salman and walked him to the plane. So it's a very significant thing. So you see these things, and then there's.
We thought it would be interesting.
So, well, this is what Barbara Leaf. She's a assistant secretary Middle East at the U.S. State Department. She was talking in front of Congress last week, and here's what she had to say about what's going to happen when Biden goes over there.
And they were amenable to working on trilateral issues, religious coexistence and tolerance, water and energy. Since then, the secretary was co-host to a ministerial in Israel, the Negev Summit, which we are turning into an ongoing mechanism, a yearly meeting at the ministerial level of Egypt, Morocco, Bahrain, UAE, Israel, U.S. We hope Jordan will engage eventually. We would like to bring the Palestinians into it. So it is, in the first instance, working across a series of shared cooperative ventures. So we're setting up working groups right now on water, on food security, tourism, health sector, et cetera. So
here comes the money quote.
Deepen those connections. It's an integration piece. I will say there are so those are the countries that have relations already, new or old. We are working in the space that is not in the public domain with a couple of other countries. And I think you'll see some interesting things around the time of the president's visit.
Okay. So that's sort of a tip-off, and that's what Barak Ravid at Walla News in Israel came out and said, the White House is formulating a roadmap for normalization between Israel and the U.S., and they're going to use negotiations over these islands down here near this NEOM that Mohammed bin Salman has started to build. This is the Al-Akbar newspaper. They don't like Mohammed bin Salman. They've had a number of articles about him, and this is a report from their press that Mohammed bin Salman, they had 26 people on trial or being tried in absentia in Turkey for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and a few days either before or after Mohammed bin Salman went to visit Erdogan, the Turkish cases were all dropped. Saudi Arabia says, we'll take care of it. So this is from Al-Akbar, I think yesterday. It's essentially saying the rehabilitation the rise of Mohammed bin Salman. This is a significant thing, I think, that's happening. So we have these, we had the guy from the premier of Iraq, went to Riyadh and met with Mohammed bin Salman yesterday. That is fairly significant in this space. So we have these guys, they're all running around negotiating. And then in the Wall Street Journal this morning, there was this, well, it was reported earlier this week, just two things and I'm done. Israel is building a regional air defense alliance with the U.S. help. The CENTCOM, which has taken over the area of Israel, General McKenzie, they're having meetings and that type of thing. And so Danny Gantz earlier this week was saying we're building this air defense pact that's already stopped some of the Iranian aggression that's taken place. So it's called the Middle East Air Defense Alliance, MEAD. And it even came up in an interview with King Abdullah of Jordan and CNBC the other day in which he said this. Whoops, here it comes.
What are you hoping to hear from President Biden? Because this is an administration that many would criticize in saying they've been out of touch with the region.
There has been this narrative out there for a while that the U.S. is out of the region and other parts of the world. I've never bought into that. I believe that where the relationships between Europe and the United States were not that good recently, what the Ukrainian-Russian conflict did is bring a very strong European-American alliance back. And I believe that the message that the president, one of the messages that he brings to the region is that count on the West, count on Europe and the United States, because we are going to be actively engaged, as he will have probably the same messages for the Americas and for Africa and for Asia.
Yeah. One of the things that folks in the United States are very much focused on, obviously, is the relationship between Israel and the rest of the Middle East. And we've seen the Israelis come out with a Middle East Air Defense Alliance in the last few days. Is this something that Jordan is looking to be a part of in an effort to combat Iran?
Well, those are issues that are being discussed regionally. I think we want to look at the bigger picture. And one of the issues are based on regional projects. We want to see how inclusive we can be. And again, if I was in Iran looking at the regional projects and how a lot of this is moving towards the West, where's my part in that?
Yeah.
And so can we put political differences aside to do something right for the peoples of the region? And I think that's where we're heading more on these discussions.
Do you think we need a NATO for the Middle East?
So NATO's can be complicated if you don't understand what the charter is and what the mission statement is. I believe you can build a NATO with like-minded countries, and that's something that I've always believed in. We in Jordan have a rapid deployment force. We work actively with NATO all over the world, have been for ages. The relationship with NATO from a Jordanian perspective is actually we're partners. And I'd like to see more countries in the area come into that mix. But we've got to very clearly define what is our role.
So you have this discussion going on. So I'm just telling you is when you look at this in the context of like Psalm 83, look at how all this is coming together. And now you have the Iraqi guy going to meet with the Saudi guy. You know, one of the pieces of this would still be Lebanon. But I think that we'll see how it goes. I'm just saying as you're seeing this alliance forming, Egypt is part of it. It's all coming together. And it's interesting, you know, King Abdullah II was a little bit weaselly, I would think, on the way he answered that question, like-minded countries. But we also know from Daniel 11 that there's certain parts that are delivered out of that are protected from the Antichrist, and it happens to be the area of modern Jordan. So it's be interesting to see how this all plays out exactly. And then one last thing, I promise, this is it. This is a significant meeting that took place. So while Abdul is doing the CNBC interview, his military chief is down at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, at the resort there, meeting with military officials from Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, and Bahrain. And the whole purpose of that, you notice who's not part of that. You don't have Iraq yet. don't have Lebanon yet, but you have Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, and Bahrain talking about an air defense alliance, MEAD, to counter the Iranian air threat, because they think there's going to be a war, and they are preparing for war. And the U.S. was also involved in that meeting. And they're talking about sharing information in a better fashion other than phone calls. That's going to be electronic, rapid exchange of information, because they need a rapid exchange of information if attacks start. So Iran's preparing for it. Hezbollah is preparing for it. Now, all of these other nations are preparing for it on the side of Israel against Iran and Iranian proxies. So you have the octopus strategy, you have MEAD. I'm just saying, familiarize yourself with Psalm 83, because I think it's going to be more significant than a lot of us have thought for a long time. And then you couple that with what you read in Ezekiel 38 and 39, Israel at peace. That sort of implies that, well, they're not at peace now, so something must happen between now and then. And I think it's a war with Iran. I think it's lining up that way. And Turkey is kind of the wild card right now, but they seem to be aligning with Israel right now too, because they're aligning with Israel and the Saudis. Why? They have the money. And Turkey inflation is the second highest in the world. It's 128% from last year to this year. I think it's bad around here. Imagine. So, crazy things. And this is a petition that's on the front of Israel Hayom this morning about our system is broken. Our system of government is sick, and here's suggestions on how to change it. So you can maybe go to Israel Hayom and look at that. So a lot of things going on. Do you agree? I'm just scratching the surface. I mean, I didn't talk about AI. I didn't talk about the World Economic Forum and all the things that are going on there. I didn't talk about the things that are going on in the World Health side. It's crazy. It's insane. So do what I always tell you from Romans. Stand firm in the faith and act like men. It could be a rough time for a while. I don't know how long. As I said, I'm not a prophet, but I can certainly look at what's going on. It's there's a lot of things converging and a lot of things accelerating. So let's pray. Lord, thank you for the blessing that you gave us to give us some guidelines of things we can look for in these times, and to understand that these things are happening not out of your gaze, but that you are in control. And Lord, I just pray that you will help us to, as it says in Romans, to stand firm in the faith, act like men, give us opportunities to share the gospel with those around us, knowing that the way things are going in the world right now, we don't know when the next conversation we have with someone might be the last one. And we need to act that way. So bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.